Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, a webinar on EN ISO 14083 on the greenhouse gas emissions accounting for the transport operations. It is a webinar taking place in the context of the new Commission's proposal called CountEmissions, and it will also handle and talk through some other relevant EU legislations. My name is Els, and I will be moderating the webinar in the background today. Can we go to the next slide, please? So by default, you're also all muted. You cannot speak out loud, but you can use the Q&A panel to submit your questions should you have questions. The speakers will have a look at the questions afterwards and try to reply as many questions as possible. Should your question remain unreplied during the webinar today, please don't worry, because we intend to make a report available so you can have a look afterwards. Should you be on Twitter or X, as we call it today, feel free to use the hashtag training for standards. You can find Sen and Senelec at Standards for EU. So if I'm not mistaken, on the next slide, we have an overview of our speakers. I'm very happy to welcome 3 speakers today. My colleague Christina Thorngreen is sitting next to me. She's project manager at Sen and Senelec. Mr. Alan Lewis is Chief Technical Officer at the Smart Freight Center and the project leader of the EN I just mentioned. And we have the pleasure to have with us Policy Officer of DG Trade, Mr. Nicolo Pieri. So please, Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Els. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Christina Thorngreen, Project Manager in the Energy and Living team at Sen and Senelec. So I'll be introducing you very briefly to Sen and Senelec. So Sen is the European Committee for Standardization. Senelec is the European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization. And together with ETSI, we are recognized by European law via EU Regulation 1025 of 2012 as the official European standardization bodies. So just to kind of show you let's say the players in the field. So we have different levels of standardization. We have international, which is the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission. And they are then mirrored at the regional or at the European level with Sen together with ISO, and then Senelec, the counterpart of the IEC. And we, Sen and Senelec, are made up of national standards bodies, which you can see on the left here. So all different, 34 European countries are represented. And also good to know that all Sen members are members of ISO, and Senelec members are members of IEC. And we aim to have identical standards, whether it's at European level or worldwide. Just a few words about the different types of deliverables that Sen and Senelec develop. So the highest level, if you will, is the European standard. This is a normative document which outlines requirements for the standard users. Then we have the technical specification. This is also a normative document, but we also refer to it as a pre-standard because it allows our national members to adopt the technical specification without having to withdraw any conflicting national standards. And then we have the technical report. This is an informative document which doesn't include any requirements, and it's more a sort of explanation of the state of the art on a given topic. And finally, there's the possibility of developing a Sen workshop agreement within a Sen or Senelec workshop. And this is a very fast deliverable that is done outside of our technical committees. And that summarizes it for me. And I will hand over to Alan Lewis from the Smart Freight Center.
Thank you, Christina. And hello to everybody who's joined today. I wanted to start by introducing a couple of slides on the timeline that has led to the development of ISO 14083, because this has been a long process. As you can see, there's been a lot of activity, not just in the standardization world by CEN and ISO, but also a lot of industry activity dating back pre-2010. I could have put the clean cargo bar back a few years further, but also from international legislators and regulators. There's been a lot of activity through the European Commission research programme, policy studies, and also a lot of support from the US Environmental Protection Agency linked to its Smart Way programme, which again predates 2010. In the standardization area, the first standard for transport greenhouse gas calculation reporting was the previous EN 16258, which was developed and published in 2012. And then there was also an international workshop agreement that was conducted in conjunction with the COFRET European Commission Research Project, and that was conducted in 2014-2015. So as you can see, that goes back a long way, and a lot of the activity that I and a few specific others have been involved with is to bring all this activity together when so much is going on in parallel. That actually is what makes standards so much more important, to make sure that there is that alignment and recognition of a consensus-based approach. And I'll talk about that further in the next slide. If you could flick on, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Following on from the International Workshop Agreement and working with a set of industry partners, Smart Freight Centre, we developed the GLEC framework, which was basically the mechanism by which we've engaged the industry partners and other organisations such as the regulators, to really act as the basis, the principles which have been pulled together into ISO 14083. And as part of that process, we've been reaching out to many different organisations to ensure that there's as much alignment as possible on the underlying principles. We made sure that we had a very strong industry buy-in before we thought about any of this, and that was really what underlaid the new work item proposal in 2019, and which has then led on to the production of ISO 14083. So it was definitely a great achievement and milestone when ISO 14083 was published in March 2023, and we continue to work to really make sure that as many people and organizations as possible are aware of the standard, what it means, and actually how that can work together with ongoing activities by other legislators and industry partners, associations, and individual companies going forward. If you could click on again, please. One of the key things was to recognise that the transport sector, which 14083 addresses, fits very importantly into some other standards that were already forming part of the 14,000 series. And this diagram, which was produced in the relatively early stages of the process, I think was key to explain to some people actually why 14083 was needed, not only for the calculation of transport chain emissions themselves, but also how that would feed into, for example, product carbon footprints through 14067, and also the greenhouse gas inventory of companies, which is through 14064, because both of those activities rely heavily on transport in some form or another. And so the publication of 14083 really does support consistency for those activities as well. So when we set out, the objective were really to provide an update to EN 16258, because by the time 14083 was published, the previous standard was 11 years old, and there's been so much development, both in terms of understanding climate change, but also how the data that can be used to calculate a transport carbon footprint can be collected, manipulated to inform that, and what the best ways are to report the outcomes from the calculation. So overdue update, but also to expand that globally, because although the previous standard was focused very much on Europe, there was a lot of activity going on around the world, and transport is by definition a global industry, not limited to national boundaries. Obviously, there's the work that's being done on the GLEC framework, as I mentioned already, and also the prior work from EN 16258 that we needed to bring together and embed in that standard. And one of the key points, the requests that we got that made us embark on that process, was the need to have an official standard as a reference point for development and application from legislators. And that is one of the key reasons why we have the link to the European Commission for the second half of this webinar, due to the support that we've had and the long-term planning to bring this into legislation. It also provided the opportunity for the passenger sector to have the bar raised as regarding the calculation and reporting processes for passenger transport, the opportunity to match that with the development work that had been going on in the freight transport sector. We're now in a situation where we have the GLEC framework still as a companion implementation guideline for ISO 14083, and I think it would be very useful to have something similar to that for the passenger transport sector as well. So if you could click on again, please. Thank you. So what ISO 14083 provides is a standard for quantification, so calculation and the reporting specifically of greenhouse gases. That's not necessarily the full climate impact, because there are other aspects potentially beyond those greenhouse gases. But what we have there is a methodology document, as I say. So it sets out in great detail the approach that needs to be taken from right the starting point of the data collection through the calculation and various different aspects of allocation of the emissions to different aspects of the items, whether that's freight or passengers that are being transported through the chain. It's also important to note that it does include hub operations. So for passenger transport, that would mean the operation of a station, whether it's train or bus, or for freight transport, the handling of goods within a transshipment centre or a terminal at a port, that sort of thing. Also important to note that ISO 14083 does not include its own verification guideline, so that would be reliant on probably a combination of the existing guidelines that cover greenhouse gas calculation, but also potentially a more detailed verification guideline aligned with this content, but outside the direct scope of ISO. And the existing EN 16258 has now been withdrawn to be replaced by ISO 14083. We do still get some queries where existing legislation or policy documents, company documents refer to EN 16258. So clearly it is a an ongoing process to make sure that those are all updated. If you could click on again, please. So in terms of the scope, we have existing standards and established practice that underpins it in terms of the approach, but we take a full fuel cycle approach. That means that the calculation covers the any emissions that are generated through the production and distribution of the energy source, whether that's a conventional fossil fuel or biofuel, or electrical energy is becoming more common. The scope includes all UNFCCC greenhouse gases, so not just the carbon dioxide, which is still the primary contributor, but also other gases which are produced at combustion, or which might be released due to leakages of refrigerants during the transport, and that again could apply to either passenger transport for air conditioning systems, or for freight transport due to temperature control for cool chain operations. At the moment, black carbon emissions and high altitude emissions, which can occur from transport, are not included within ISO 14083's normative sections. There is an informative section about black carbon as a starting point for any organisation that wishes to include that. So also we're looking very much at the moment at transport chain operations, so the movement of the vehicles. So at the moment, emissions relating to maintenance, long-term storage of product, vehicle production, and vehicle scrappage, the transport infrastructure or overhead operations are not included within this first version of the standard. We've had various discussions between many different people about whether some or all of these should be included. For some, maybe the technical understanding isn't yet developed enough to include them. For others, there's a feeling that they're already covered by other ISO standards, particularly, for example, vehicle production. The feeling was that that would already be covered within ISO 14067, and if someone wanted to do a full life cycle assessment, they could bring in that from the product carbon footprint. Also important to reference that transport operations does include the repositioning of vehicles, even when they're empty, because they're a key part of the overall operating system, and a vehicle cannot pick up passengers or freight if it hasn't already been operated, emptied, and transferred to the new location. We have a well-established allocation by mass for freight transport, linking through to the idea of transport activity with the ton kilometre, passenger kilometre for passenger transport, but also some alternatives for container and parcel transport in the freight sector are accepted as additional metrics in specific circumstances. The calculation excludes carbon offsets. In fact, we think that this calculation gives a very good idea of what the actual emissions are, which would be fed into an offset calculation, but that is a separate activity. And the annexes, I've already made reference to the black carbon annex. There are several informative annexes which do give an indication of where climate assessment for transport would be going in the future. If you could click on, please. In terms of what's new, modes, additional modes, pipelines and cable cars that weren't covered in previous documentation. The terminology has been updated, so I'm going to talk a little bit about transport operation categories, but reference to things like hubs, so that we have neutral language that could be applied to both passenger and freight transport. References to updated definitions of data types, and also the energy cycle, so that we're clear about what the emissions are with energy provision in the upstream part, and then the emissions that come from the operational phase. There are a lot of equations within the standard that gives us much more rigor in the approach for the application of the standard, particularly around allocation of emissions between cargo types or between passengers and freight. But that did take a lot of developing to make sure that they are correct and comprehensive. We also include a high-level emission factor methodology within the one of the normative annexes, which is a first step on that road. And that's really important because emission factors are included in every single calculation. So without that, there would have been potentially a lot of scope still for misalignment of calculations. And also alongside that, we have an informative annex which provides some examples of emission factors calculated using that emission factor methodology in the normative section. And that is a development to what's been previously in the EN 16258 standard and in older version of the GLEC framework. But as is the nature of emission factors at the moment, it's a very fast moving field. So we're already aware that climate science has moved on. So some of those values in that informative annex are already out of date, and we keep an eye on that through updates in the GLEC framework, and also I guess in other national and international documents and legislation. If you could move on again, please. One of the things that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is this focus on the transport chain. It's the emissions that occur when either a passenger or a freight moves from their starting point to their ultimate destination. And the idea is that you can bring together the emissions that occur at every different stage and combine those in a consistent and comprehensive manner. So it's important to understand actually what's happening at each stage in the transport chain, which is what we refer to as a transport chain element, and that we have a consistent approach for each of those stages. If you could click on again. And when you take a system approach like that, which is covering a full journey from a consignment or a passenger, it's really important then to relate that movement to the movements of the vehicles that would be used to conduct each of those separate elements within the chain, or the activities at the handling points whereby the passengers or the freight moves from one vehicle to another. I'm going to focus on the transport side, but there's an analogy this for the hubs. Basically, the transport operation category is what provides the context for the transport movements for each and every movement of a consignment or a passenger, and is defined as a group of transport operations that share similar characteristics, and it's probably the most important element within the standard. So if you could click on again. The reason why we have this approach of the transport operation category, because it's really important to understand that vehicle movements don't happen in isolation. That vehicle isn't necessarily coming for an individual passenger or a consignment. Sometimes it does, but even when it does, it's coming from a point where it's been for a previous journey, and as soon as it's made that individual journey, it goes on to conduct another transport element as part of another chain. So you have a lot of the time consignments being moved for multiple customers. You have clients who are using multiple carriers. So the interaction between the two levels, between the consignment and the transport operator and the ultimate customer, is quite a flexible thing. And a lot of the time, the vehicles are operating in an interactive way, in such a way that it wouldn't necessarily make sense to try to collect the data and manipulate it at that individual journey level. It makes sense to work at this more aggregated level, where you bring together the characteristics of the vehicles and the operations that are aligned with each other. And you can take that to different contractual arrangements, the different nature of journeys. So in the freight sector, having multi-drop journeys, that would be typical in an urban area versus the long distance delivery, and also different handling requirements, whether that most commonly would be temperature requirements. So if you click on again, please. What's really important is that there is an understanding about the level of data aggregation that makes sense for the transport chain element and the operation, to bring them together so that there is a good match in the mind of the transport operator and the customer, so that you have the right level of specification, so that you can match up the characteristics of the transport operation category and apply it to each individual element within the chain. And I'm sure that sounds very complicated for people who are meeting that for the first time, but it is very much the key to understanding how the standard works. If you could click on again, please. I've already mentioned it's important to include the emissions associated with empty mileage due to vehicle repositioning. Generally, they would be effectively appearing in the figures for a transport operation category, effectively as an overall average for the system across the operations that are included within that operating category. It's also important to include the any emissions that come from ancillary equipment, particularly if you have, say, refrigeration equipment which is being run off a separate power supply to the vehicle's engine. Also very important to capture those refrigerant losses, because although the amounts of refrigerant that are lost are relatively small, the global warming potential for those gases is very, very high. So if there were a problem, for example, with a piece of equipment, it would be important to make sure that you're identifying that, quantifying it, and using that information to take action. If you could click on again, please. Moving on towards the end of this, the reporting requirements are quite extensive. There are effectively two levels. One is reporting at the service level related to the actual individual operations at each transport chain element, potentially aggregated to a service level if one organization is providing a service which is multimodal, including subcontractors potentially who are operating individual aspects of that. And then also the opportunity to aggregate that for organizational level reporting. There is a strong match between the required reporting outputs for the two levels, so that one can be aggregated into the other. And if you could click on again, please. Just my final point, which isn't directly related to ISO 14083 itself, but does pick up on the topic of emission factors. Although we've got a high level standard or starting point for a standard within one of the annexes of ISO 14083, it isn't necessarily particularly detailed. It sets out some principles that are a must for what should be included. But emission factors are so critical to transport sector calculations that we have actually just been successful in securing another research project from the European Commission's Horizon Research Programme, which will be looking at emission factors to improve the understanding, improve the international harmonisation. We are hopeful that will be some form of standardization process embedded within that project. Formally, that will kick off on 1st of June this year. So if you haven't heard anything about that and are interested, then please do feel free to follow up afterwards. And that's that for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for this interesting insights on the standard. A few questions came in while you were talking, so if you can have a look at the questions, we might have some time left after the presentations, but if you can already reply some of them, that would be, I think, very helpful for the attendees who raised the question.
Okay.
So I think that in the meantime, we can continue with welcoming Mr. Nicolo Pieri, who is a policy officer at the Commission at DG Move. So please, Nicolo, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, and thanks to everyone. And directly go to the next slide. So I will present today the CountEmissions EU proposal, which is a proposal for a regulation on the accounting of greenhouse gas emissions of transport service. It has been developed by the Commission, in particular DG Move, as I am one of the pen holder of the proposal. It will be a regulation, which means that from its entry into application, it will be applicable to all member states. It has been adopted by the Commission together with other initiatives in July 2023 inside the Green Freight Transport Package. It has been screened by the Council and received the general approach on the 4th of December 2023, and the European Parliament voted on its proposal and amendments last week, the 4th of April. The main purpose of CountEmissions is to provide a harmonized framework. So for calculating the greenhouse gas emissions of the transport operations, we said transport services, where transport services we mean transporting freights or passenger from an origin to a destination, implying multiple transport chain elements requiring both transport operations and hubs or operations. Next slide, please. As I said, a CountEmissions EU regulation has been adopted in the Green Freight Transport Package, together with the rail capacity regulation, the weights and dimension directive revision, and also the revision of the Combined Transport Directive, which has been adopted some months later. But they are, in a sense, all of them interlinked, and they build on previous initiative already put forward, such as Fit for 55, the Efficient and Green Mobility Package. The decision to publish those are in order to reach and to provide additional tools to reach the objective of the Commission in the climate law, so the decrease of GHG emissions and the climate neutrality. Next slide, please. So with this slide and next slide also, I will try to provide you a little bit of policy, but also methodological context, but I will go quite fast because Alan provided you a very good overview of what has came before CountEmissions EU. More than 10 years ago, we published the 2011 white paper on transport, where there was the initiative number 29 on the harmonization of carbon footprint practices and methodologies to solve the patchwork that was already at the time existing in terms of carbon accounting methodologies. Then in the 2020, we adopted the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, where under the flagship 5 on decarbonization of transport, there was the Action 33 on the EU framework for harmonized measurement of transport and logistics emissions. Then we provided a letter of intent to the European Parliament, explained in the section 33 as a legislative proposal, as a regulation, on a new framework for harmonized measurement of transport and logistics emissions, to reach the objective, to support the reaching of the objective of the European Green Deal. Then in the European Commission Work Programme 2022, which is the document one of the main, the most important initiatives in the year to come are published, there was the publication of the EU framework for harmonized measurement of transport and logistics emissions. So imposing on us that this was the objective in the 2 years to come to adopt this regulation. Next slide, please. So again, this is a kind of very small, very fast repetition of what Alan provided, much better than I could do it, as in the context of the impact assessment, which is the procedure that that comes before the adoption of the proposal by the Commission. So it's a full study that has been done with the support also of ECORIS, CE Delft, and with some experts such as Professor Alan McKinnon. We scoped for what already exists today. So because the first option is to take what already is has been developed today as a methodology, which is one of the main parts of CountEmissions EU, the choice of the methodology. And then we went back in the history. We looked at 2012, the 258 standard, then the COFRET project, then the GLEC, and then we reached the publication of the ISO standard in 2023. Next slide, please. As our objective, as I said, is to provide a common framework for calculating GHG emissions of transport operations, which means that we cover multimodal door-to-door transport chains, individual transport and hub operations for both freight and passengers. And as we adopt, I have to say this, we adopt the ISO standard as a reference methodology. So we also strive to use as much as possible the terminology. What we don't follow is that we don't require the mandatory reporting. We leave them on a voluntary basis, so they can follow the rules set out in the ISO standard, but CountEmissionSEU does not oblige the reporting of the greenhouse gas emissions from transport services. Next slide, please. We asked ourselves what we want to achieve. Our general objective was to incentivize behavioral change among businesses and customers to reduce GHG emissions. So we don't provide hard incentives such as financial incentives, because CountEmissions is a tool that is put at disposal of EU or national legislation, and also at local level, to have a single and harmonized method to account for the emissions of the transport service. Then we wanted to assure the comparability of results from the GHG emissions of transport, and to facilitate the uptake of GHG emissions accounting with a clear set of rules and also guidelines that will be provided during the implementation phase. Next slide, please. I think I can jump this, as it's a summary slide. So if we can go to the next one, I will go section by section. So to explain a little bit more in details in a much clearer way, what is inside the proposal. The scope, we decided to develop an approach that we call binding opt-in. So CountEmissionSEU, the adoption is voluntary. It means that we don't oblige any entity to calculate and disclose to any third party the calculations of the GHG emissions of transport. But if they decide to disclose their calculations, then they have to follow the rules in the CountEmissionSEU. So binding opt-in is that we don't make it mandatory, but if you want to disclose your calculations, then you have to follow these rules. It applies to any entity providing an organizing freight and passenger services in the EU, calculating the emissions. This, as I said, our objectives are transport services. So at disaggregated data, we don't mandate reporting, which also means that we don't look at aggregated data. Our objective are transport services, so from A to B, individual transport services. Next slide, please. The second part is the reference methodology. As I said, after a careful impact assessment, which lasted 1.5 years from 2022 to 2023, we decided to adopt the ISO standard in the European version of the ISO standard of the 14083. But we also provide the need for an assessment in case that there are some needs, that there are some adjustments to be made to the standard to reach our objective. So we created a kind of safeguard clause in the Article 4 to assess the amendments, the potential amendments to the methodology. We also provide possibility to exclude certain elements in the future updates of the standards, not going in the direction that are to reach the objective of the regulation, and also to request the standardization body, so assent to revise the standard. And also we provide a possibility for having a secondary act to clarify some aspects of the reference methodology that may not be clear, together with the guidelines that will be anyway published during the implementation period. Next slide, please. Input data are the second most important part of CountEmissions EU. We provide with first a database on the GHG emission intensity that can be derived from a core EU databases of default values for the GHG emission intensity, and also what we call third-party data sets. We don't want to trash, let's say, what has been already done by the operator, very good effort in terms of data collection, modelization, and secondary data. But we want them to be in line with some aspects that will be checked by the Commission and by the European Environmental Agency, which will be in charge of creating what we call the core EU database of emission intensity values. The access to the EU database will be free of charge. The model data will have to rely on a model established in accordance to the ISO 14083 standard. And as I said, this will be done in coordination and mainly concretely by the European Environmental Agency, both the creation of the core databases and the quality check that will be clarified during the implementation period. Second, next slide, please. Concerning the output data, we also mutuate from the standard that we take as a reference methodology, the minimum requirements for output data for the metrics, so the total mass of CO2 equivalent per transport services, the CO2 equivalent per ton kilometer, the CO2 per equivalent per ton or equivalent units, and per passenger kilometers, and per passenger or equivalent units. We also leave room in the future for potential additions, so to complement the list of the metrics in case of need. Next slide, please. On the communication and transparency, in the Article 10, we also give rules to the disclosure of the output data. So this will have to be very clear. We also provide a very clear line to publish when this data are disclosed, and we also provide rules for the data intermediaries. While the data intermediaries are not covered, are not in the scope of this proposal for a regulation, they will have to follow CountEmissions EU if they calculate and disclose their data. But if they just disclosed if they only disclose, apologies, the data that are received from those that calculates the emissions, then who does the calculation is in the scope of the regulation. Then we also provide the rules following the standard on the evidences that substantiate how the output data were established. While we don't, as I said, mandate the reporting, we have to ensure also that the evidences underpinning the calculations are available to those that receive this calculation in order to check that these calculations are done accordingly to the regulation. Next slide, please. We also leave to the market the provision of the external calculation tools, because during the impact assessment we realized that there is a market for the calculation tools that they are already provided. But these private or available on the market calculation tools have to be certified by an accredited conformity assessment body. And the certificate of conformity will be valid for 2 years. The rules for the certification of the calculation tools are demanded to the implementation phase. Next slide, please. Then we provide a general framework for the verification. As Alan previously said, the ISO 14083 doesn't give exact rules for the verification, but in CountEmissions EU we developed a very broad framework for the verification, demanding to a secondary act, so to the implementation phase, the creation of specific verification rules. Why this? Because we have a number of legislations that are ongoing at the same time, so they are in parallel. For example, the Refuel EU labeling for the aviation in the context of the Refuel EU aviation, that we have to check that the verification rules are aligned. So in order to make these verification rules aligned, we need a little bit more time to clarify and to provide verification rules that are clear, comprehensible, and aligned and harmonized also with the other legislations. Next slide, please. Apologies, just last thing before, because this was my last slide. What we propose in CountEmissions EU is to make the verification mandatory, and which will last for 1 year, for bigger companies, but to exclude from this verification obligation the small and medium enterprises. This is because even if we realized during the impact assessment that the 20% about the 20% of the SMEs would undergo anyway the verification to make their greenhouse accounting of the transport services more solid, this would entail an administrative cost that not all the SMEs would like to have. Therefore, we exempt the small and medium enterprises from the mandatory verification. And then I think I finished my presentation, and thanks a lot. I will see to reply to some questions.
Yes, thank you, Nicolo. A few questions came in indeed. So if you can have a look, that would be wonderful. I would like to thank Ellen for taking care of a few questions while you were talking. And I also noticed that Ellen tagged a few questions. So we still have 10 minutes to go over questions. I see that, for example, Stephanie is asking or has a bit of a problem in understanding the decision to take a location-based approach to electricity consumption. She would like to know if it means that there is no incentive for companies to invest in green electricity. Ellen, can you clarify this?
Yes, I can. We had some long discussions about this. One of the issues you have when you're producing a standard like this is, as I showed in the diagram, is that you have to make sure that the standard is aligned with other existing standards. Because if you write something different here, then you maybe lose compatibility with what the requirements would be for existing standards like 14067 or 14064. And so as within the working group, we have a wide range of different expertise, including people who are very active with those other standards. And because those other standards are already specifying a location-based approach, it was felt that the location-based approach is also what we needed to have as the primary approach for electricity consumption. We do offer the option of reporting a market-based value alongside that. It's not compulsory, but if you have the opportunity to do that, if you have the right data, then you can do that as well. So that's the answer I have for there.
Thank you, Alan. There is another question that might be, or I hope it can be replied by you. It's in relation to the full fuel cycle approach. Bart wants to know if why this was chosen instead of the often used tank to wheel approach.
Yeah, this is absolutely critical to have a fair comparison between different energy sources, particularly as we're looking to decarbonize the transport sector. One of the key aspects is a change from your traditional fossil fuel to alternative fuels, whether those are biofuels, e-fuels, pure electricity. And the full impact of the energy source is the full fuel cycle. Traditional fossil fuels, there has been a typical contribution of the fuel production distribution of something like 20% of the operational emissions, and it's give or take roughly the same for all fossil fuels. But as you move through the energy transition, you get a very different balance between the different energy sources, and it's really important to actually do any analysis and comparison on that full cycle. We still, within the standard, request that the operational and the energy provision components are reported separately so that you have that transparency and you can see it. But if you don't do that, then and you only work on a tank to wheel basis, you risk, for example, for electric vehicles, reporting a zero value without understanding whether or not the electricity provision is low carbon or high carbon. And you just risk shifting emissions to reporting in a different sector and not understanding the full impact of any decisions that are made.
Okay, thank you, Alan. I've seen many questions still in the Q&A. I'm afraid we will not be able to reply all of them, but Nicolo, can I please ask you to pick up one or two? And then while you do this, I would like to also launch a poll. It's actually a feedback poll for attendees that we launch for every webinar, where we ask about their feedback on the webinar in order to improve our webinars in the future. So if people can have a few, take a few minutes of their time to reply, that would be nice. So please, Nicolo, go ahead.
Well, actually, I also apologize. I forgot also to mention one of the database, because CountEmissions EU will have two databases. The first is about the core database on the intensity values, as I mentioned, and the second one is the emission factors database, which will be a single database that will be created with the support of the Clever project that Alan mentioned, and which will also have to be harmonized, of course, with the current legislations, just talking about FuelEU Maritime or ReFuelEU Aviation and the Renewable Energy Directive revision. I also apologize that I was missing one slide with a direct link to the proposal and to the supporting study. So this is also replying to one or two questions asking for the documents. So I will share with Sen a new slide to be integrated, if this is possible to be shared or to be made available to the audience. And concerning the verification documentation, well, the verification rules will be developed in the implementation phase. When I refer to the implementation phase as from the moment that the regulation will be published, so agreed with the Council and the Parliament, which means potentially not before the beginning of the next year, it will be published in the Gazette, in the European Gazette. And then the implementation phase starts. We propose for the implementation phase 42 months, because we believe it is 3.5 years is the right amount of time to provide good database, good rules for the verification and for the quality check. And which means that with a very highly hypothetical timeline that CountEmissions EU will enter into applications, let's say 2028, 2029. As I said, this is highly hypothetical. So verification rules, quality check, and also certifications and accreditation rules will be developed during the implementation phase with a lot of consultation with stakeholders, with the expert, and with the member states. If I may just reply also, why not mandatory? As I said at the beginning, CountEmissions EU is providing a tool. We didn't go for a mandatory tool, as we assessed during the impact assessment phase that the cost would be much more than the benefits. We adopted, of course, a very conservative approach in quantifying the benefits, but then in the documentation that you will see for the impact assessment, if we made it mandatory to hold the transport operators, or those that would publish and use the accounting, the cost would offset the benefits as we stand today.
Okay, thank you, Nicolo, for clarifying that. I realize there are a few questions still unreplied, but I would like to suggest to close down the webinar here, because we've promised our audience to make it last for about an hour, so we're 2 o'clock already. As promised, we will make a Q&A report available, so should your question still be unreplied now, we promise you to give the answer as soon as possible. The webinar has been recorded as well, so you can have a look afterwards should you would like to do so, or share it with colleagues. You will receive the presentation and the recording in your inbox later today. I would like to thank the audience for listening, for filling in the feedback poll. If not done yet, it's still open, so please go ahead. And I would like to thank, of course, Christina, Ellen, and Nicolo for the interesting presentations. So thank you very much, and see you hopefully next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.